This is Radio 4. Coming up next, a podcast of spurious morality.
And now we need to use the wrong era's theme tune. As we
We need a Howl theme.
I'm not doing that again. It took me ages to come up with the first one. Hello and welcome to a podcast of spurious morality. I'm Johnstone and this week I'm joined by Connor.
Hello.
And I am joined by Mansoor. Hello.
Hello.
And we're going to discuss audio Doctor Who, but not the audio Doctor Who you're expecting. Unless you've seen the episode's title, in which case you've probably worked out we're talking about BBC Radio stuff. So the spoiler warning today is basically not Big Finish, mainly BBC Radio Doctor Who. So Pescatons, Paradise of Death, Ghosts of N-Space, Slipback. We're going to discuss Redacted a bit as well, and some others, some that have had vinyl releases, that kind of thing. So we're not sort of trapped within the usual massive Big Finish continuity spoiler warning. It's quite a nice, easy one this week. So obviously, before there was Big Finish, and indeed since there's been Big Finish, there has been Doctor Who on the radio. I think it all started with the Pescatons. I'm fairly sure the Pescatons was the first ever one. Interesting little story with Tom Baker and Elizabeth Sladen while they were still in the roles at the time in the 70s. It's a bit of a strange one. But we'll come back to that in a moment, because first of all, I'm going to ask you guys what your favourite not Big Finish radio, BBC, whatever you want to call it, Doctor Who is. So you go first, Connor.
It sort of has to be the Pertwee stuff, the Paradise of Death and the Ghosts of N-Space, for reasons that we'll talk about a little bit later. But I think they just feel the most substantial of these these different projects, and it's an absolute joy to hear that cast back in their roles again.
Yeah, that's definitely sort of one of the highlights of it. You've got actual Doctor Who audio drama with Jon Pertwee where you can understand what he's saying, which is a bit of a novelty. Sorry, that was an unfair dig at Zagreus there. Mansoor, what's your favourite?
I had a lot of trouble understanding what he said in that, so I'd say it was fair personally, but it's I think I agree. Out of the two, probably Paradise of Death. If we were to expand and think about like things beyond radio, like webcasts, I might have a slightly different choice. But yeah, out of the ones that we're looking at today, it's the Pertwees, definitely.
Yeah, it's well, as we've said, there is something kind of special about hearing Jon Pertwee, Elizabeth Sladen, and Nicholas Courtney all back playing their classic roles. We've also got it was 90s, wasn't it? In fact, am I right in thinking that N-Space was actually broadcast after Jon Pertwee had died? I think they maybe recorded it a couple of years before and kind of sat on it, and then he died, and then it came out. Or maybe that was the CD release, cassette release.
I think the way it worked was they'd made Paradise of Death first, said maybe we'll do another. They didn't. The BBC sort of didn't really have much enthusiasm for it. They then rebroadcast at some stage, played an episode out of order, and the amount of complaints that they received made them think, "Oh, there actually is an audience for this. Let's do another." And then they made the Ghost of N-Space.
So Doctor Who fans complaining, did Once Upon a Time create something positive?
It was January, February 1996. I've just looked it up, and he passed away just before the TV movie in
It was
May,
May,
didn't he?
wasn't it? Yeah. All right, so there we go. I was slightly wrong there.
Oh, close.
Yeah. So anyway, the first one we've got down to chat about is the Pescatons, which I find it to be quite an odd one. It almost kind of invents Big Finish's Companion Chronicles format, sort of 35 years too early. But there's a lot in there to enjoy. Tom Baker's enjoying himself. It's not a flat performance. It's good to hear Elizabeth Sladen in there as well, obviously. But yeah, huge chunks of it are kind of narrated or just the two of them. But it works. It's a nice solid story. So, what are your thoughts on it, Connor?
It's a little bit strange. It's a little bit odd to listen to. Certainly when you're more used to the more modern Big Finish stuff. Pescatons feels, even for the time it was made in, like a wee bit of a throwback. There's this sort of meticulous and formal, slightly old-fashioned feel to the dialogue. It's almost very sort of scientific. In the way that the Doctor speaks, is something about it, and it's the way these Pescatons work. It's like everything's a slightly more alien concept than we as Doctor Who fans are used to. It's a little bit. It's a little bit sort of more. I associate it with a lot of sort of classic radio serials, that sort of thing, that sort of style. But I've always thought it's rather charming. It's not good. I don't think it's fair to call it good. But charming is the word I would use for it. I do have this on vinyl. It was released on vinyl for Record Store Day a few years ago. And I remember listening to it at the time and thinking, okay, pretty cool to have some Doctor Who on audio. It's maybe not quite what I want, but I like that it's there, and it's very nice to have a Doctor Who story with the Fourth Doctor and Sarah Jane. It's very nice to have a story with the Fourth Doctor and Sarah Jane, on audio that was actually made during their era. So that's a big plus to it as well. The story itself is it's a little bit nonsense. It's very sort of B-movie sci-fi. But I keep coming back to the word charming. There is just that certain charm in the execution of it all.
It's funny you should mention the Record Store Day re-release, because on that exact Record Store Day, I went into it was tiny little record shop. It wasn't doing Record Store Day. It was just normal record shop open on a Saturday. And in there, for I think it was $2.99, was a copy of the original release of the Pescatons. So somebody had obviously got rid of their old version to make room for the Record Store Day release. And I thought, you know what? I'm having that one. So my copy is an original copy. However, I did buy it on that exact Record Store Day.
There's a guy who works in Forbidden Planet in Belfast. I think his name's Mal. I'm not sure, but I always say hello to him when I'm in. I had gone in on that day. I think with Pescatons, I'd been to. There was a wee independent shop in Belfast at the time. I'd been there. And gone into Forbidden Planet afterwards, and he says he spotted it, through the bag. He says, "Oh, you got it then?" I went, "Yeah." I'm excited to listen, and just sort of leaned in, give him a sweet smile. He says, "I have the original one." Away he went.
Obviously, it's an exclusive club having an original copy of the Pescatons on vinyl. No, it isn't. Mansoor, where do you stand on Pescatons?
It's I kind of like with the Pertwee ones. It's nice hearing Elizabeth Sladen with Tom Baker, because we had some Big Finish stories with her as Sarah Jane, but um, sadly they never overlapped to do a story together. So that's quite nice to hear that, to hear them together on audio. Um, it feels a bit awkwardly structured to me, and I think because it was originally released on a record, I'm wondering if there was some last minute chopping or editing of the script needed to get it to fit into the runtime. Because I feel it sort of lurches forward a little bit in places, in terms of structure. Uh, so yeah, so it's a bit of an oddity, but for me, but yeah, the novelty of hearing the two leads together is really welcome.
I think that's one of the advantages with sort of modern Big Finishes. They're not tied down to a runtime in the way that anything we're discussing today really was.
Yeah, I mean it's an advantage, or it's a freedom, but then you sometimes have the opposite problem of like things not being edited when they should be, and yeah, and I know Big Finish at one point sort of made a bit of a decision to be a bit more disciplined with that a few years in, um, and to sort of not let episodes consistently overrun. Um, but yeah, there is that danger sometimes. I think that when you're not restricted by space, yeah, sometimes a story can be longer than it needs to be.
Yeah, and it's hard to say whether what's worse, a story that's too short or a story that's too long. But yeah, I noticed the same thing with Pescatons. It does have those sort of odd moments where it just kind of catapults us further along the story without actually giving us chance to figure out why we've moved on or how we've moved on. I think
I,
it's. Oh, go on.
I have actually read the Target novel version of the Pescatons, which is just with you talking about, skipping over a lot of things. Like there's lines of dialogue in this. We went here and we met this person, and then we went to do this. And there's whole swathes of the story get skipped over in that regard. The novel does put a lot of that back in. And, we do, those characters get dialogue, and we get scenes, where the Doctor's introduced to them, and it all plays out very naturally then. The novel's the same in that it's charming, and that's maybe all you can say about it. But it does feel like a more, you're getting the fuller version of the story. It's expanded out in a lot of ways, to fill the novel. So that's it's strange. We've come on to review an audio, and I'm saying read the book instead. But it does give you the more fuller, um, um, the more fully realized version of Doctor Who and the Pescatons.
It's something I've often heard about. A story I said we weren't going to mention this episode. Scream of the Shalka. Obviously, that got a novelisation as well, and I'm told that the novelisation is something really worth reading. Actually, it adds a little bit more, that kind of thing. But we'll say Scream of the Shalka for the inevitable webcast episode in probably the not too distant future. We're coming back to Pescatons. I'm glad it exists for many reasons. Tom Baker and Elizabeth Sladen on audio together. It's another Doctor Who by Victor Pemberton. I'm a big fan of Fury from the Deep. And actually, it's definitely got more than a whiff of Fury from the Deep about it. You can tell it's the same writer, and a lot of the same sort of ideas are in place there. An enemy from the depths, all that kind of thing. TARDIS landing on a beach. But I think it's probably something that should be looked at as a bit of an experiment. Can Doctor Who be done on audio? And I think as an experiment, it's probably successful. However, it did take them a decade to do anything else like it again, which is obviously Slipback we'll talk about shortly. But for now, we'll move on to the Paradise of Death. We're jumping forward. So this is the 90s. and this is John Pertwee and Elizabeth Sladen and Nicholas Courtney all back to play their original characters in brand new Doctor Who drama, audio drama, and it's a strange one. I think Paradise of Death is. I think that they were trying to go really, really modern and 90s with it, but they were setting it during the Doctor's original hanging out with unit time, and it kind of feels a little bit disjointed because of that. But it's an enjoyable story, certainly. So, Connor, what do you think of Paradise of Death?
I really, really liked it. And you hear these, you hear sort of received fan wisdom, over the years, you hear about the John Pertwee radio stories, and people say, "Oh, they're not very good." Rubbish. I had a really good time with these. So first and foremost, as I said earlier, it's the best thing about it is being able to hear John Pertwee, Elizabeth Sladen, and Nicholas Courtney playing, their characters again. It was just this really lovely, rich experience to hear those characters with those voices. I know we hear them a lot with Big Finish, but they have all been recast. I love them. I love what Tim Treloar and Sadie Miller and John Culshaw are doing for Big Finish. But this was really, really special to be able to hear the originals as they were on TV, in a brand new story. I get what you say about they're trying to be 90s, but they're sort of slightly hamstrung by the fact that it's set in the 1970s, etc., etc. I didn't mind that at all. Or is
it 80s?
I didn't mind that at all. I thought that worked quite well because it did give you this sense that it's brand new and exciting Doctor Who. They're not trying to slavishly recreate the original era. They are trying to do something new and something, to push forward a little bit, which I was a big fan of, and as I say, it did lend to that feeling of this being new and exciting. That feeling's also sort of helped by the fact that the cast don't exactly sound the same. They still sound very, very close to their originals, but you can tell they're all a little bit older, and a little bit more experienced as well. They don't sound as exactly the same, but they're still those characters, and it feels like you're meeting up with a couple of old friends, after a long period of time, which I suppose it probably did feel like, for both them and for the listeners. You also get Peter Miles in this story as well, playing a sort of really, really, really psychotic version of Nider, which was a lot of fun. He's maybe even the highlight of this story. And we also get Jane Slavin as well, which I was very, very surprised by and very, very delighted to hear. She's very familiar to us as Big Finish listeners because she turns up a lot in the Fourth Doctor stories and across, their range. So we're very familiar with her voice. And I was just like, oh, it's her. There's a little bit of the future of audio Doctor Who, in this, It's not fair to call this the beginning because it wasn't the first Doctor Who audio story made, but it feels like that in the same way that seeing Lisa Barman turn up in Survival feels like, oh, there's a little glimpse at the future of Doctor Who. So yeah, that was quite nice as well.
Yeah, it wasn't the first story. It wasn't even the first full cast because Slipback came first, but it was the first time we'd done the Big Finish thing of recreating an era that was like a couple of decades in the past. So it was, in a way, it was the first time we'd had like a non-contemporary Doctor and companion team on audio.
And I think it's probably the first time there's an audio-only companion as well.
Yes, Jeremy.
Our good friend Jeremy Fitz-Oliver.
Connor, what was your reaction to Jeremy when...
I went into these not knowing that Jeremy was in them. I've heard of Jeremy over the years. And I always, in all honesty, I thought Jeremy was a myth made up to scare younger Doctor Who fans like me. Um, so when I started this, and I'm sending you a photographer. His name's Jeremy Fitzoliver. I was like, oh God, no, it's him. Oh no.
It's like Slender Man, but Doctor Who.
It's time. It's like I genuinely thought he had just been made up to scare younger fans.
Jeremy sits inside your head.
Well, I have heard Jeremy now. Jeremy has been inside my head, and it's an experience I will repeat not willingly in the distant future.
Yeah, and eat you while you're listening.
I genuinely, in all honesty, I didn't know these were the stories with Jeremy, and it was a very visceral reaction to hear his name and then to hear him, and you know, a lot of things Doctor Who fans complain about, and you know, as I say, you know, like as I said earlier, people say, oh, the Pertwee radio stories were rubbish, and I listen to them and they're not. And it's like people say, you know, Jeremy's awful, and I'm listening to him now, and yes, he is.
So at least that bit's accurate. I think he's perhaps the only bit that people remember. Like, even while planning this podcast with you guys, I've referred to them as the Jeremy stories a couple of times. And maybe that's it. Like, it's such a dreadful character, and he is a dreadful character. He's annoying, and it's not what I want to see from a sort of 1970s supposed to be Doctor Who companion.
Am I right in saying he doesn't actually do anything until near the end of Ghosts of N Space? Like, he's just there to complain, and then it gets to the end of the second serial and he does something, and it feels very deliberately written in that, oh, look, Jeremy's doing something. He does have a reason to be here.
There's something in the concept, like, you know, we saw it on TV with you know, the kind of joke about Rory is Amy's companion, or like the companion having a companion. It's kind of in the Hex Ace dynamic as well with Big Finish. So there was potentially something there of like Sarah's got her companion, but yeah, maybe not executed in the most engaging way. But like, just on the modern concepts thing, I completely agree with what Connor was saying, that that's kind of what I want from if you're doing a non-contemporary TARDIS team. The TV stories already exist. There's no point trying to just like slavishly recreate something that would have been broadcast at the time. Yeah, totally update it with modern ideas and like, and I think actually, Paradise of Death. When I was listening to it, when I was re-listening to it now, because I bought it when it first came out on tape, and was quite excited to get it at the time, so I might be a little bit nostalgic about it. But re-listening to it today, yeah, it's kind of talking about VR, which was the trendy stuff that was being talked about in the 90s. But I think there's a lot you can read into it now retrospectively about social media uh, and like AI and you know, false information being spread online. There's a lot of those sorts of themes that you know, I'm sure weren't intended fully, but happen to sort of be quite prescient and quite contemporary even today.
So in some ways, it's accidentally ahead of its time.
Yeah, totally. Like, I think there's a lot you can look back at it now and see, actually, yeah, that's you can read it with a sort of modern contemporary lens as well.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting take on it, actually. Yes, I agree with that. Just to return to Jeremy, we'll go on to Ghosts of N Space in a second, but just to return to Jeremy,
must we?
There's yes. You might find some solace in what I'm about to say. His eventual fate is revealed in a past Doctor adventure, and basically it's Instruments of Darkness, it's called, and it's a long time since I've read it. It's probably about 15 years since I read it, but basically he starts messing about with the iris machine, wipes his own memory, and ends up becoming a villain one of the many, many villains in Instruments of Darkness, and sort of, from what I remember, dies fairly unpleasantly. So at least there's that. We'll move on then.
I'm just disappointed to find out that there are indeed more Jeremy stories that I will unfortunately stumble across someday.
You don't actually find out he's Jeremy until after he's died. The Doctor kind of turns around and goes, "Oh, poor old Jeremy." It's just like, it's the big twist at the end of the book. The bad guy was Jeremy Fitzoliver all along.
Oh, good Lord!
It's fantastic in an interesting kind of way.
I cannot think of a more ignominious end for a character, and I can't think of a character that deserves it more.
Well, it's the last entry in a sort of very loose trilogy that I would recommend reading. It's a Gary Russell trilogy, and it's the first one, Scales of Injustice, I think it is. The second one is Business Unusual, and the third is Instruments of Darkness. And yeah, they're well worth a read. It's sort of it's a fun little trilogy that has some running themes and characters through them, and makes Jeremy Fitzoliver into a bad guy.
Feeling very negative, and I've done a lot of complaining. I would like to just on behalf of myself, just to say that I did enjoy this story, and I thought it was very good. Just to counter some of the negativity that has flown freely from me in these last few minutes.
Well, we'll move on to the Ghosts of End Space, and there's plenty of room there for positivity, isn't there?
I quite liked it.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
go on then.
It's. I thought it was decent. Like it's even less doing the whole slavish recreating of an era, because we just lose the whole. In the first episode, there's the whole setup of the unit investigation. That's gone entirely. It's the Brigadier on holiday. Sarah Jane just happens to be in the same place. That feels a little bit strange, but fair enough. So yeah, it's again, I quite liked it. I like the whole thing about the Doctor and Sarah having to travel back in time to find out about the mystery that of the ghosts that has gone through this family, this family's history, and the way some of that builds up about Sarah meeting, I think it's the White Lady in the future, and then meeting the character in the past. I've forgotten her name, unfortunately, who is going to become the White Lady, and Sarah's horrified by this. I was like, there's a really nice moment. Well, I say really nice. There's a moment where Sarah says, "Oh, Doctor, we have to do something. This girl's going to die," and he just turns around. Well, yes, of course she is. You've come from the future. She's been long dead. It's that whole thing about the perspective of time of a time traveler, which I thought worked really well. So that was I quite liked that, their little trips back into the past. I'm maybe not so keen on some of the stuff in the present day with the Brigadier and he who shall not be named, Jeremy, where they're sort of taking on this mobster. And I know it ties into the Doctor's stuff going into the past, the Doctor and Sarah's little side of the story. It's fine. It's weird. It's weird sort of imagery about the demons and the ghosts sort of swooping around this castle while the Brigadier and Jeremy shoot at them. Fair enough. But again, overall, I had a good time with it. I enjoy hearing the third Doctor, Sarah Jane, and the Brigadier again with those actors playing them. And as I say, I really, really liked the Doctor and Sarah's trips into the past. So yeah, I did enjoy this one. I had quite a good time with it.
There's definitely quite a bit to enjoy in there, but I've always found that it just sort of, there is too much like the stuff going on in the modern day and Jeremy and all that kind of thing. But yeah, it does have some great moments, and I think the stuff surrounding the Doctor and Sarah is definitely the sort of highlight of it. What are your thoughts on it, Mansoor?
Yeah, I don't mind it sort of breaking the format and doing something even more different from the TV era. I think the problem was that yeah, it got. Was this one like one episode longer, or it felt like it was just a little bit too long? That all
Yeah,
these different
this
strands.
this
Was it
was
five
6, whereas
or
Paradise was
six?
5, I think.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So five is already quite long, and then this pushes it up to six. And I thought like the going back in time is interesting because you don't always see that in a Doctor Who story. Often the TARDIS, it's often not a time travel show. It's often just that the TARDIS is a way to get the Doctor to a specific time and place, and then the adventure happens there. So yeah, it's always a nice change of pace to actually have time travel in the story. And then, like when we get to Stephen Moffat, it starts to happen like much more regularly. Um, but the one bit that didn't work for me, and this is like something that happens with a lot of audio that sort of makes me, it just might be a personal thing for me, just makes me sort of disengage a little bit, or makes it harder for me to pay attention, is when you have like very very noisy chaotic action scenes. And I think you can do action on audio. There's like a way of doing it, and I quite like it when it's done well. But like I found it a bit hard to follow. It was just like a bit of a um, with all the stuff with the demons. It just like felt like quite noisy to me.
Yeah, there's a little, I guess, too much action. There's an awful lot in there that's actually quite visual, which, when you're listening to a radio drama, isn't ideal, really. But it's certainly not the only Doctor Who audio that is guilty of doing that. It happens quite a lot. I've been listening to sort of the Big Finish unit stuff on and off recently, and I've found that there's a lot of action in there. There's like big chunks of episodes that are right. Let's throw in all of the gun and grenade sound effects we have, and that'll, that sort of thing. So yeah, there is quite a lot of that, but it's certainly not unique to Ghosts of N Space. But I'd say of the two, I'd say I probably enjoy Ghosts of N Space more. But I think that's because it just gives us a little bit more of the Third Doctor and Sarah as a TARDIS team, and that sort of that strand is really nice to follow. I find
It also has Harry Taub in it, which gets many, many points from me. It's always very fun to hear. I actually didn't realize it was him because he's not doing his normal accent. He's Uncle Mario. And I was reading through the cast list and I was like, oh, this is instantly so much better for having Harry in it.
I mean, they've both got very impressive casts, really, haven't they? In terms of people that have been involved with Doctor Who, there's quite a lot in there, quite a few good actors in there.
It's Sandra Dickinson in the second one, isn't it? Is the sort of I've forgotten the character's name again. She's the mafia mobster's partner, and then she sort of comes over to the Brigadier's side.
Yeah, is it Maggie? Is it?
I'm not sure. I'm gonna have to look it
I
up.
can't remember now.
It's Sandra Dickinson, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I think Jane Slavin's in one of them as well, who would obviously go on to be Anya Kingdom in Big Finishy stuff. I'm fairly sure she's in. I think it might be Paradise of Death.
It was. I'd said a bit earlier on there. I'm just reading through for Ghosts of N Space. Stephen Thorne was Max, which is that's another throwback.
They definitely sort of consciously went with names that are associated with Doctor Who while casting it, and I quite like that. It's sort of a nice touch, and it's again something that Big Finish would go on to do. When you think about, particularly in the early days, the number of classic Doctor Who guest actors that were popping up in Big Finish. Obviously now, 20 odd years after Big Finish started, sadly there aren't as many classic Doctor Who guest actors with us. But in the early days, it was certainly something that they kind of obviously consciously set out to do. And I thought that was quite a nice touch. And obviously, we get a lot of new Who actors in Big Finish now as well. So it's a tradition that, in a way, has been continued.
Looking at the Paradise of Death's cast list, and Trevor, the most notable one is Trevor Martin, and he played the Doctor on stage in Doctor Who and the Daleks in the Seven Keys to Doomsday. Try saying that when you're when you've had a few.
Like, okay, we shall move on. We shall move on to, or should we? We'll slip back. No, we won't. We'll move on to Slipback. So Slipback was done. I think it was done during the infamous 80s hiatus. It has the Doctor and Perry, who were the current TARDIS team, in there, written by Eric Saywood. So it's theoretically very, very of the era. However, it's a 6-parter, which we didn't have in the era. I suppose we had the 2 Doctors. So, Connor, what are your thoughts on Slipback?
It's a thing I've heard. I did this in 2 settings just earlier this week, actually, and it's something that I was quite interested to hear this one because I'm quite a big fan of the 80s Doctor Who. But I, in all honesty, don't remember very much about this one, and I literally heard it just this week. The 10-minute episodes do not help it at all. I sort of find that made for a very, very sort of fractured listening experience. I probably would have preferred. I think I might do better with this one if I maybe edit it into 2 half-hour episodes. But it's I find it difficult to pay attention to. There's a lot going on. It's very busy. There's a lot of different characters to try and keep up with, and it sort of jumps between them very quickly because, again, they're sort of limited to those 10-minute episodes. It's nice to hear Colin Baker and Nicola Bryant playing, the Doctor and Perry, and sounding exactly the same as they did at the time because it was recorded at the time. But it's as I say, I don't actually remember anything about the story. I remember. It's nice. It's certainly nice to hear Valentine Dial. And I think this was recorded literally just a few weeks before he died and came out a couple of weeks after. So that's it's quite strange. It's nice to hear him there, but it's a little bit of a strange experience as well. But it's out of all of the stories that we've got on the list to talk about today, it's definitely the weakest, I would say.
Yeah, I did find the short episodes to be quite odd. I mean, I found the sort of pacing of the whole thing to be quite odd, really. It seemed to start off very Douglas Adams-like, I guess. There was a lot of stuff in there that was sort of very, very Hitchhikers-ish. And that seems to get abandoned around the second episode, and it just goes back into being dark, bleak 80s Doctor Who. I did find myself at the episode 5 cliffhanger going, why is this called Slipback? And then it is mentioned in the 6th episode, so it justifies its title in the final episode. But yeah, the first couple of episodes I actually quite enjoyed because it was sort of Eric Saywood having a go at doing Douglas Adams, and it sort of worked, in an era where Doctor Who was criticised for being overly dark and overly violent and all that kind of thing. It was quite nice just to have this sort of fun 20, 30 minutes at the beginning of this story, but then it kind of settled back into a less than great version of mid-80s Doctor Who. Mansoor, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, definitely feels like someone trying to write a story that's in the style of Douglas Adams, but it does have a lot of that Saywood style still showing through. I think there are some scenes that I think, if ever done on TV, would potentially be quite gruesome, from what I remember. And I didn't hate this. I thought it was all right, and it's so I was listening to it or re-listening to it recently, and because I'm quite used to Big Finish recreating eras, I was thinking, oh, they've gone to a lot of effort to recreate the musical stings and sound design and make it sound like a TV story would have done at the time. And then I remembered, oh no, this was made in the middle of Colin Baker's era, so that's why. So that's quite nice that it's like of its time. It sounds era authentic. But yeah, I think the short episodes, I agree, make it feel a bit slight. And also, this is like not judging the story on its own merits in isolation, but doesn't this give us a contradictory explanation for the creation of the universe? Like, not that long after Terminus. I'm forgetting the details of the story, but isn't that the conclusion, that it's there's something about creating or triggering the Big Bang?
Yes, that was the first thing that sprung to mind when I listened to it. It was, hang on a minute, that's contradicting Terminus, which they only did a couple of years before,
Yeah.
which Saywood script edited.
It's not just that it contradicts it with a nearly identical explanation.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then again, in the Pertwee era, Azal destroyed Atlantis until the Master did 1 year later. So it's not the first time. So it's fitting with Doctor Who. I like to think that Eric Saywood was going, I'm going to create the same kind of problem that the Demons and the Time Monster and the Underwater Menace all created as well.
I love what you've basically just credited Eric Saywood with saying there was, I'm going to cause problems on purpose.
I mean, every other Doctor Who writer's done. Why shouldn't Saywood get to as well?
You make him sound like that naughty goose in the computer game, but like the Doctor Who script editor version, which is just today I'm going to cause problems.
All we need now is like somebody to come along. Russell T Davies needs to do an episode in the immediate future where the Big Bang is created by a spaceship venting fuel or something like that. I'm just trying to think if there are any other examples of this in Doctor Who. Is Earthshock the only time the dinosaurs get wiped out? There's got to be another example. If you can think of another example, tweet at us. Because I'm genuinely curious, when does Doctor Who contradict itself?
There's things that have been set up that I predict are going to be contradicted at some point. Like things like, was it like the Rachnos formed the Earth, or also like what happened with the Moon? Like those are like quite big things about the Earth and the Moon that I'm sure at some point are going to get contradicted.
There's all the stuff about the first Doctor having one heart, and then as it develops, he's like Patrick Troughton ends up having two or something like that.
Or even being alien, like that was that explicit? They talked about their people in An Unearthly Child, but that could have been like a future human colony or.
See, the problem I have here is I've seen the pilot episode probably just as many times as I've seen An Unearthly Child, and I completely get confused over which continuity is which, because they do contradict each other.
They say they're from the
in
future.
The pilot, they're from in the pilot they're from the future, and then in An Unearthly Child they're aliens.
Well, they say our people, but I guess I'm saying that like you could read that as our people is like future humans or spacefaring humans.
I still haven't seen An Unearthly Child. I've never watched it. I'm saving it for the 60th.
It's an interesting one to watch because it obviously did a bit.
I feel like that's my darkest secret as a Doctor Who fan. Yes, I've done the books, I've done Big Finish, but I've never done An Unearthly Child.
I mean, as we talk, I'm actually working out whether it's viable to just completely edit you out of this whole podcast.
We're talking of contradictions. There's An Unearthly Child, but because they novelised the Daleks first, that's the book of that is written as the first ever Doctor Who story, like where Ian and Barbara meet.
The Barnes Common stuff, isn't there?
I was going to say, that's where the whole Barnes Common thing comes from.
Shall we push on? Have we said all we're going to say about Slipback? I think we probably have. I think we've said all we should say about Slipback.
I was going to say I could say many more things about Slipback, but it's maybe best that I don't.
Don't make me dig out the bleepy sound effect again. Well, just as we start to wind this episode down, there's just one more thing I kind of wanted to discuss, really, which was obviously we've had kind of, I guess, the modern equivalent of a BBC produced Doctor Who radio drama. We've had Redacted just over a year ago, which was a drama podcast released once weekly, featuring loads of sort of Doctor Who characters, all relatively recent ones, and of course the 13th Doctor herself. I just kind of wondered where Redacted stood in comparison to the other things we've discussed today. So you go first, Connor.
I remember talking about Redacted at the time. I can't even remember. I know we did an episode on it. I can't remember what I said about it at the time, as I've got a little bit more distance from it. I think it's strange that it doesn't really have, at least in the early parts of the series, it doesn't really have an identity of its own. It's sort of relying on the guest characters coming in, or the new three main characters sort of looking into the events of past Doctor Who episodes. And it doesn't really have much of a storyline of its own at the beginning, and it slowly becomes more so over the course of the series then. And it sort of breaks away from, it starts off with that podcast format where you're listening to episodes that these characters have made, and then it eventually at some point just sort of becomes a standard audio drama about their lives. I love that it has Jodie Whittaker in it. I love that they have this, they're doing, I'd said for a long time, and lockdown, I suppose, was in my head, should have been a perfect opportunity to do it. That when Doctor Who's in its off season and it's not on TV, it would be really nice to have a couple of radio stories and audio adventures with the current cast, because they don't take up an awful lot of time to record, as far as I am aware. Like Big Finish have always said, like at discs, an hour's worth of recording is one day. So it's there's not a huge, from the point of view of having a cast, the TV cast do it, it's not a huge time commitment. So I always thought that would be really cool to do, and they finally did it with Redacted. So I'm a big fan of doing that. Having an audio series on when Doctor Who's not on air that does sort of tie in to the TV series in some way. I am looking forward. I hope they're going to do. I don't know if a second series has been announced or anything. I'd love them to do one, and I would certainly listen to it. But I think I would like it to have a little bit more of its own drive as a series, throughout this time, rather than more near the end as the first series did. I'd like a little bit more, I suppose, having its own identity rather than constantly revisiting the events and the characters from other Doctor Who stories.
Yeah, it's Redacted kind of went down the bringing back loads of well-known characters route, but didn't quite do it in the same way that Big Finish does, I guess. The characters that were in it fit into the story, and it was about the universe that centres around the Doctor breaking down and that kind of thing. So naturally, people that know the Doctor would come out of the woodwork. But yeah, it's an interesting point. Mansoor, what are your thoughts, sort of Redacted compared to the other stuff we've talked about?
Just on a side note, I believe it is coming back for a second series, but there was that bit of controversy with is it Ella Watts?
Yes, they've replaced Ella Watts, haven't they?
Yeah, and yeah, it sounds like it wasn't like whatever the decision making behind that. It sounds like it maybe wasn't done in the best way from the way that she tells it. But yeah, it is coming back. Last we heard. Yeah, I appreciate it for the fact that, like we were saying before, like it's doing something different, and yeah, and it's kind of like even more different because the Doctor's in it, but very briefly. And I thought those early episodes worked okay. They are. I think maybe we noticed those things from familiar stories because we know many of those stories. But it'd be really interesting to hear from someone who was coming to Redacted completely fresh and hadn't consumed much Doctor Who before, because I felt like it was written partly with that sort of audience in mind, or trying to do the best of both worlds, like be written in a way where you could take the perspective of these new characters encountering all these other people, but then also if you know the whole history of the show, you are constantly spotting all these existing characters popping up. So yeah, I thought it was uh, yeah, a welcome fresh take, and yeah, I'm looking forward to more.
In terms of what Connor was talking about before, kind of the audio Doctor Who literally plugging gap years, I guess, which is sort of what Redacted did. We only had 2 new episodes of Doctor Who last
Yeah,
year. It's kind of what Slipback was doing. It filled the hiatus, and to a lesser extent, it's what Paradise of Death and Ghost of Endspace did. Taking that sort of, looking at it from that perspective, I'd say Redacted probably did the best job there because it's telling a story about essentially the Doctor being missing in a year where the Doctor was missing.
I agree. I I think this would take a lot of lining up because TV production works at a completely different pace to like audio production. But in an ideal world, what I'd quite like is like you have something like Flux, so there's like a big event where you've got 6 connected episodes on TV. What would be really nice if there's like a kind of supplementary strand or something like that fleshes out part of that plot on audio that runs alongside that. So like not going like full Time Lord Victorious where it's like a million different strands across different media, but just having like a kind of audios that tie in to what's going on TV, but maybe told from the perspective of like a sort of new character. Um, yeah, but I get that would be potentially tricky and complex from production and timing points of view.
I think sort of one thing, and this is something Big Finish will inevitably do sooner or later, but I think one thing that sort of pops up from very recent Doctor Who is the 13th Doctor and Yaz kind of had their own era and we never saw it on telly. They obviously travelled together for a long, long time. And I think that's something that we maybe could have seen. It's something they could have recorded over, when we were back in
Exactly.
lockdown, or it's something they could have given us. And it does feel like there's a huge chunk of, I guess, unseen character development between the two, and I quite like that to get
Yeah.
explored. But I don't think that's BBC Radio now. I think that's Big Finish territory now. But it's something that I kind of wish there'd been.
Yeah, I agree. Like I hope Big Finish do return to it, but I think you're exactly right. Like Star Trek Picard did this for the last couple of seasons, where they put out an audio drama. I think just before season 2 and season 3, and it was exactly that. It was kind of like a prelude or prologue that fleshes out some of the characters uh, before those seasons start. And yeah, like Yaz and the Doctor on their own would have been absolutely perfect for that.
Yeah, like I say, it's something I expect Big Finish will find the way to. But it sort of feels like maybe it was a missed opportunity, and maybe it could have added a bit to, to Flux and to Power of the Doctor, that kind of thing. Um, so I think we've talked about everything. I think we've covered it all that we're going to cover today. Anyway, obviously there's hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of BBC audio Doctor Who. There are other audio dramas. There are audio books. There's plenty that we could get stuck into, and I'm sure we will at some point. But I think really today we've looked at a very niche and unique corner of the Whoniverse, which is these actually very rare BBC produced audio dramas. And I think that in some ways it's a shame that we've not seen more. It would have been nice if Slipback was the first in a season of a few, for example. It's a shame that we didn't get more John Pertwee and Elizabeth Sladen. I mean, that goes without saying, I think. So yeah, it's an odd little corner of Doctor Who, and it feels like there's been a lot of false starts over the years. So maybe Redacted getting a second season is perhaps the start of this sort of thing becoming a bit more a bit more regular, a bit more normal. That'd be quite interesting to see. But that is where we'll leave it now. We will come back and discuss webcasts at some point. We'll come back and we'll discuss. We want to do Nest Cottage. We keep saying we need to do Nest Cottage, so we will come back and do Nest Cottage at some point soon. But for now, like I say, we'll leave it there. So I will say thank you and goodbye to Connor.
Thank you very much.
And I'll say thank you and goodbye to Mansoor.
Thank you.
And we will be back for more Spodcasting very soon. Goodbye now.